Well, 10 or so years ago, the bottom literally fell out of the Sydney rainwater head business. Now, unless you've been totally off the grid in the last couple of years, you would know that there's this thing called AI, artificial intelligence, that's becoming very quickly way smarter than we are. And whilst a lot of people may be afraid that there's now something that's way smarter than they are, I kind of embrace it because I accepted a long time ago that I wasn't the smartest chip in the block. So how do you take advantage of a way smarter person or thing out there? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And I think the answer is learn how to ask the right question. Because the only way to learn, if you don't know anything, is to ask the question, right? But not only that, you've got to ask the right question, because if you ask the wrong question, you'll get the wrong answer. And that's going to lead you to somewhere that's not very helpful. So back to the question. Why did the bottom literally fall out of the Sydney rainwater head business? Well, to answer that question, you've got to know that in Sydney, there's a company called ACE that makes a lot of rainwater heads. So why do they make a lot of rainwater heads? Well, because a lot of people buy them. So why did the bottom fall out of their business? Well, to understand this, we've got to ask the question, a rainwater head, what is the purpose of a rainwater head? Now, there are multiple purposes. One obviously is an aesthetic one. You want the rainwater head to look rather nice and blend in with your house. But the most important thing is, functionally, what does a rain head do? Well, simply put, a rain head is a transition device. And why is it a transition device? Well, what it does is that it catches the water that comes off a gutter. And usually it's a hidden gutter, like a box gutter. So you've got water in the box gutter that runs out, and you need something to collect the water and then drain that water that's caught into a downpipe, because the downpipe is what goes into the ground and gets drained away into the stormwater system. So somehow you've got to collect the water that is being collected by a box gutter, which is a box shape. It's quite big. You've got to collect that much water into a vessel, and then once it's in the vessel, then the water then can go into a downpipe. And that's what a rainwater head does functionally. It's a transitional device, collects the water to allow it to go into a downpipe so it can drain away. And you would think, well, that's all I need to know about rain heads, right? But if that's where you end your line of questioning, you just don't know really what a rain head does. So back to the original question, why did the bottom fall out of the rain head business for ACE? Well, if you understand that a rainwater head is a transition device, it means it catches the water from a gutter, but it also catches a lot of dirt and a lot of debris. And what's meant to happen is that if ever the outlet, the downpipe outlet from the bottom of the rain head gets clogged up, then the rainwater head would overflow, and you'll look at your rain head and go, oh, I've forgotten to clean my gutters and clean my rain head. Now it's all blocked up. Perhaps I should get up there and clean my rain head and my gutters. So that way, a rain head is just a canary in the gold mine. It sort of warns you that you better do something or there's going to be a leak back into your house. So why does the bottom fall out? Well, if you imagine that you've got a metal rainwater head, even the colour-bond rainwater head, and it's got debris at the bottom, and it's got moisture there all the time. So what happens over the years with constant moisture at the base of a rainwater head? Well, you start getting rust, right? So traditionally, when ACE made their rain head, they made it out of a painted zinc-aluminum base metal. And under the harshest conditions of constant moisture, even their Duracoat or the colour-bond material would start to rust. And so what happened was that all of a sudden, all these ACE rain heads lost the bottom. and because the bottom was rusted out. So we had to go around pulling out all these rusted rain heads and putting in new rain heads. And we still used the ACE rain heads. So why did we continue using the ACE rain heads even though we knew that the bottom would fall out? Well, ACE reacted to this problem, and what they did was they converted all the rain heads to just aluminium, handled with care. So all the ACE rain heads now come in aluminium, which means they're never going to rust out. So the bottom stays, and the bottom is never going to fall out of the ACE rain heads. Bravo! And now, because the ACE aluminium rain head is such a handy item whenever a rain head is called upon, builders and roofers defaulted to the ACE rain head. So if you drive around Sydney and you look at all these new houses that have got parapet walls, and as a result they've got box gutters, and the box gutters empty out into rainwater heads, the majority of them have the ACE rainwater head. Now you need to ask another question. Is this something that's peculiar to Sydney? Well, the answer is yes, because ACE is not that prominent in all the other states. So in Victoria, for instance, you won't see many of these ACE rain heads. You'll see a multitude of other types of rain heads, and in Victoria there are more strict guidelines as to what sort of rain heads can be installed and still comply with the code. So the next question here in Sydney is, what's wrong with the ACE rainwater head? Why can't we use the ACE rainwater head here in Sydney for every time that we need a rain head? Well, the answer really is that if you were to take the ACE rainwater head and you would install it in a situation where you've got a box gutter draining into the back of the rain head, this rain head doesn't comply. Now hang on there, you might say, why does ACE make their rainwater heads then if they don't comply? Well, I think the reason is, for a lot of applications, especially in the past, the ACE rainwater head was quite suitable because it was used for a different purpose. Nowadays people tend to use the ACE rainwater head for everything. So it means that when you have a box gutter discharging through a wall, they'll take an ACE rainwater head, cut the back out and plonk it on the wall. They might put a tiny little round overflow hole or a square hole and go, that's it, it should work. Well, does it work? The answer is strictly no. Now your next question should be, why doesn't it comply? Now we've got to go all the way back to basically the function of a rain head. So what a rain head does is that it's a transition. It catches the water and sends it down into a downpipe. But if we use a transition device like a rain head to collect discharge from a box gutter, then the rules change slightly. Whenever there's a box gutter involved, the number one aim is do not let the box gutter overflow. And that is really critical, because if the box gutter overflows, then you get a massive amount of water inside your house, cause a lot of damage. So a box gutter should be allowed to overflow outside the house and not back into the house. So if you were to put a rainwater head to catch the water from a box gutter and you get a bit of leaves and it blocks up the downpipe, the rainwater head should fill up, but before it gets to the underside of the box gutter, there should be an allowance for the water to get out. In other words, overflow. So if you use a rainwater head to catch water from a box gutter, the rain head needs to have an overflow. And the overflow has to meet certain dimensions. And those dimensions are calculated so that the water doesn't back all the way up to the underside of the box gutter and then go back into the house. So there are calculations that you can do to determine what the overflow size is. And usually the overflow size is across the full width of the rain head and a certain depth. And this dimension is quite large. So if you were to take a ACE rainwater head and just put a few circular holes on the sides or in the front, that's not going to do. Now the question from those who drive around and look at all these new houses with rain heads that are like the ACE rainwater head, and you say, well, obviously those rain heads don't comply with the code, right? And the answer is yes, they don't comply. Well, the next question is there any way that you can make the ACE rainwater head comply? And the answer is yes. But as always, there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. So one way to make the ACE rainwater head comply is, if that's the back of your rainwater head and you've got a box cutter discharging into the rainwater head, to make this whole thing comply, you have to lower the rain head down the wall so that you've got the discharge of the box cutter on a higher level. And then the water then falls into the rainwater head, and the water will never ever back up into the box cutter. It will in fact overflow the top of the rainwater head, and this rainwater head is perfect. So what's wrong with this solution? What's the trade-off? Well, the trade-off is aesthetics. Aesthetics? Well, if you have a rainwater head that's lower than the invert of a box cutter, when you look at the wall, you'll see a hole where the box cutter is. So when you look at a house, you've got a rainwater head, you'll see a rectangular hole above the rain head. And for most people, that's not a good look. And that's the reason why people use the ACE rainwater head. They raise it, they cut the back of the rainwater head and put the box cutter into the back, so that when you look at it from afar, you can't see the hole in the wall where the box cutter is. Aesthetically, it looks fine, but from a functional point of view, it doesn't comply. Now, there's another way to make this rainwater head comply, and that is to cut a big slot in the front. And this is what's often called a Ned Kelly slot. You can put a slot in the front, provided that it's low enough and it's also wide enough to suit the particular box cutter. So the trade-off is that it's not going to look all that nice because you've got a big gaping hole at the front of the rain head, right? So one way to make this look pretty is you put another cover over the top, right, that hides the Ned Kelly slot. So the water goes out of the Ned Kelly slot and it drops down along the front face of the rainwater head, but you can't see the slot because there's another cover over the top that hides it. So the next question is, why bother going through all this? Is there a rainwater head that complies? Well, there certainly is. There's a company called Dam Busters. I don't know whether they're the only ones here in Australia, but they make a rain head that complies with the code. Now this ends part 1 of this series about rainwater heads. In part 2, in the next video, we will look at how to make rain heads comply with the National Construction Code. We'll look at the Dam Buster rain head in more detail and look at the design philosophy behind it, and go into a deeper dive about rain heads and how to make them comply.